we're going to talk about good and bad bishops. What makes the difference between a powerful bishop and a passive bishop? A bishop that enables you to make bold sacrifices and come save the day from all the way across the other side of the chessboard, or a bishop that's stuck in its original square that hinders development of other pieces. And it could be a bishop with no plan, no purpose. So that would certainly be a bad bishop. And by this end of the video, you might want to think about what kind of diagonals you want, whether you want to have the bishop on its original diagonal, or if you want to even vianchetto your bishop more often. And as a beginner, if you're playing a structure like this where you think you have a very solid structure in the center, this is almost London opening, but it's not because you haven't developed your bishop first. And this is absolutely terrible. You're going to have a terrible mid to late game unless if you figure out what to do with that bishop. And by symmetry, you can, on the other side, you can stack pawns like this as well, and you're not going to be able to castle so easily with the knight and with f3, and this is just a horrible situation, and the bad bishop will always haunt you later in the game. Now we have some openings that's pretty much entirely dependent on creating good bishops in the opening. So for example, in the London system, you want to play the move bishop to f4 on move 2. And you want to just control the diagonal and just develop it. And then you want to create this very solid pawn structure here. And we have another opening, the King's Indian defense, where you can vianchetto your bishop on g7 to control the longest diagonal in the game. And that can often be a very good game for you. And so this is a very refined way of playing chess, if this is what you like. Now, we have different openings like the Caro-Kann, where you also need to develop the bishop onto f5 here, because if you don't, then when you play the move e6 without the bishop on f5, then the bishop will be hard to develop. And if you ever played the Stonewall attack, then you know that this bishop on c1, it can be a problem. And this is, honestly, it kind of feels a little claustrophobic. And claustrophobic pieces can lash out or want to lash out. And this is what it kind of feels like to be that piece. And so that's also very bad. Now, there's also some interesting openings like the semi-Slav defense, where you literally lock up the structure, put for the bishop on c8, and that becomes a very bad bishop then. But it's okay to do this unless if you know how to deal with the opening, but I wouldn't recommend this for beginners unless if you know how to deal with it, because it's just going to make you very irritated to try to figure out what to do with that bishop. And kind of the same thing with the French defense. It's the type of opening where when you play the advanced variation, the bishop on c8 is kind of hard to develop again. And we're going to just look at positions where how to deal with this in general. There's tricks, individual tricks for each openings, but maybe we'll have a trick or two for you in this video. And if you understand this concept of bad and good bishop, you can also use it against your opponent as well. So in this position, you actually want to play the move h3. It's a solid move, and what it does is actually prevent this light square bishop on c8 from developing to g4 to f5 and to e6. And the reason why I can't go to e6 is because there's going to be a pawn fork after. And so you're forcing your opponents to pretty much have a passive bishop. So that's always a good idea. So even if you didn't calculate anything, this is always good to force your opponent's pieces to be passive. And also by playing the move h3, you just avoid a disaster. And the reason why it's a disaster is because the knight and the bishop is attacking the d4 pawn while the bishop is pinning the knight. And so you're most likely going to lose a pawn here, and that's going to be you're just going to be ending up in a worse position. And so this is one of the reasons why you have to know this concept, and it's this type of framework that you can think about if you like. So in chess, in the chess world, good and bad bishops are commonly used terms, but I've also seen the terms active and inactive bishop as well. So there's distinctions between the both. So I'm going to talk about that. But another way to think about active and inactive bishop is that one is working hard and the other one is hardly working. And so you can basically your bishops could determine whether you win the game or not. Now, an active bishop will have lots of squares to go to, and while an inactive bishop, it could be trapped behind your pawn structure. It can be trapped behind pieces. It might take a while to get out. So that's for inactive. And here we're going to be talking about 4 different types of bishops. If you have a good and active bishop, you always want to try to keep it. It could be more valuable than a knight or rook or even a queen in some positions. A good inactive bishop, this might seem like a weird concept at first if you're not familiar, but I'll show some positions about this, and you generally want to keep these bishops as well. An active and bad bishop could be just very useless. It won't do anything for you, no purpose, and I'll show those positions. And a bad and inactive bishop, just maybe even on its originally starting square, could just be a spectator for the entire game. And oftentimes, if you want to develop your rooks to the center, it could just stop your rooks from doing that. So now let's see if you could intuitively spot where are the bad bishops. So try to figure out in this position, where is the bad bishop? So you can pause the video here if you want to figure it out, but the answer here is that black has a bishop on d7, which with the pawns on dark squares here, and white has the bishop on e2, which is blocked by this pawn chain in the center. Although white is, I think, in terms of the light square bishop, probably slightly better, just because this d pawn is advanced into the opponent's territory, so you have slightly more space. So regardless of that, there are still both technically bad bishops. And so here's another position. Where is the bad bishop here? So in this position, you can see that the bishop on d7 here is locked behind the pawns. And oftentimes you can have this position where the bishop is locked behind pawns and your opponent's knight is active. And there's also this kind of common misconception in chess where the bishop is better than the knight. And so oftentimes your opponent will try to trade at the beginner level, because people know that principle but don't know sometimes why. But in this position, this knight is so active that you probably never want to trade it for this bishop. And if you do that, it's probably a mistake as well. So now we're going to talk about the definition of bad bishop. So a bad bishop is a bishop that is blocked by its own pawns, making its scope and the number of squares it controls very low. So just like if you're starting the game off, you have bad bishops. So a good bishop will have control of all the squares, but a bad bishop, for example, it could be stuck behind pawns. And this is kind of a really bad scenario because you can't move your bishop even though it's worth 3 piece. It just feels like a pawn. Now, it's kind of even worse when your opponent has opposing pawns. So for example, there's you might have dark square pawns, and your opponent's opposing pawns could be on light squares. And you're basically, unless if you do something about this pawn situation, your dark square bishop is not going to ever move to those diagonals. And this is kind of like the worst case scenario where you have a close position and your bishop can't really do much. And this bishop might as well just be a pawn because it's really not doing anything. Now, here's another position. This bishop on d7 is not a good piece, but it still has potential. You could play a6 and probably try to reroute the bishop to a new diagonal if you want. But right now, the current value is probably not even 3, probably 1 to 2, depending how you look at it. Before you make this pawn chain in the center all on the light square while you have a light square bishop, you should consider, just like in the London system, to put it outside the pawn chain first. Because if you do that, then you won't get this problem of your bishop being stuck behind pawns and feeling like it gets to do nothing. Now, if your bishop is outside the pawn chain, now you have way more squares and just way more potential things to do. And this will make your bishop much better your position better to play, and it can be annoying for your opponents now to play the move. I guess in this certain position, e4, because you have a pawn and a bishop defending that square. Now, the best case scenario for your bishop, this is the bishop wet dream, is to infiltrate into your opponent's territory and then have it protected by a pawn. The pawn and the bishop will protect each other. And if your bishop is just not even allowing your opponent's king to castle, and that I've seen bishops like that, and that would be a great bishop. And in this position, it's even worse for white, particularly because white doesn't have a piece that can oppose this bishop immediately. So something like a light square bishop. So if you can get a light square bishop infiltrating into your opponent's position while they don't have a light square bishop and they can't take your bishop very easily, then that's a very good thing for you. This is something to get you very excited about. Now, if you have one bishop because you traded it for a knight in the opening or something like that, then you should try to place your pawns on the squares opposite color of your bishop. So for example, if you have a dark square bishop, try to place your pawns on light squares. And this is just like a generality. You shouldn't do this all the time, but I think it's a good tip to follow. It'll be easier to play for you because the bishop and the pawns complement each other. The light square pawns will cover the light squares, and the dark square bishops will cover the dark squares. And so you're covering both the light and dark square complexes. And the bishop can move freely. Now we're going to talk about the first type of bishop, the good and active bishop. So we know that the bishop is a very long attacking, it has a very long scope, which means that it can be on one side of the board and do it can be on one side of the board and can do things on the other side of the board. So here it's stopping the white pawns from marching up the board, but it's also is supporting the pawn push for pawn promotion for black here. And so this is a bishop that has multiple purpose, so that makes it great, and it's all on one diagonal. And this is a good active bishop. Another type of good active bishop is when you have, like I said, if you put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop, then you can have the scenario where you're controlling crucial squares in the center with your pawns, and then whatever gaps you have, your bishops can cover it. And this is a pretty decent position to play for white here. And this is good. Now let's say we're going to talk about a good but inactive bishop in this position. So you can see that the bishop is kind of locked in, but it still has some squares. And so it's a little inactive, but it's not stuck inside of a pawn chain. It at least has some squares to go to. And it's actually pretty good. This is, if you look at the evaluation here, it's 1.2. So this is winning for black, probably because of these 8 pawns here. You can probably make a play on the queen side. Now, let's say, one of the reasons why this bishop is good is because it stops white from playing the move e5. And white would actually like to sacrifice the e5 pawn so he can have the e file to play around with. So, for example, now if the bishop was on e7 here and white got to play this move e5, and according to Stockfish, you should take with the queen. And then, this position here, you just allowed your opponent to activate the rooks. And this is more of a equal game in this position. Now, here's another example of a good but inactive bishop. So we talked about the king's Indian defense, but in this example, we have a pawn on e5 because black decided to play that. You can see that the bishop pretty much doesn't have a lot of squares to go to, but this is a good bishop because it serves the function of protecting the king's safety by controlling the dark squares around it. So specifically on h6 and f6 here. Now, here's a question. Would you trade that dark square bishop for the rook magically and immediately? Well, what do you think the answer to that is? Because the bishop is worth 3 and the rook is worth 5. Is this good to do? And the answer is right now the evaluation's about even, but if you actually trade in that position, just magically, so everything else is the same, then white is actually winning, even though the rook is worth more. And the reason why is actually because you're leaving around a lot of these dark square weaknesses that your bishop was covering before. And so, and also there's also a tricky pin there coming as well. So there's just a lot of reasons. So that's why you shouldn't. That's why the value of your bishop can be very high, even though it's inactive as well. So, but let's say your opponent for some reason decides to trade their dark square bishop for the knight, and now in this position, if you decide to trade the bishop and rook, it turns out that you're winning. What a surprise, because your opponent has a trickier time to take advantage of these dark square weaknesses around your king without their dark square bishop. And so this would be a great position for you to play because you're just up the exchange here. Now, one very common thing that I've seen is that your opponent probably trades in the center. I'm not saying this is the specific sequence, but there's sometimes a lot of tactics with this particular bishop, and with taking the rook on a1. So you can also vianchetto on the other side of the board and has the same thing happen. But it's just very common tactic that I've seen in beginner games, which can shock your opponents because they probably thought they were playing for the center and they just found out they're losing a rook. Now here you can have a bad active bishop. So bad in the sense that it's locked behind your pawn structures. I guess it's locked. It's not actually locked behind your pawn structures, but it's just a very close position. It has the bishop has lots of squares to go to. It's not really doing anything, and the knight is just much better. And in this position as well, we have two bad bishops. This black's bishop can't attack any of the pawns, and white's bishop can't really do anything against these pawns as well. So that's just neither of them are really that good. Another case of a bad active bishop here, this is a very unique scenario, but this is an active bishop because it has a lot of squares, but it's kind of bad because all the pawns are on dark squares, and it's very tricky to see if you can win this or not. And actually, this is a question, but can you guess if this particular position is winning or a draw? Now, we have I'll go through some technical scenarios that I don't really have a label for, but this is technically a good active bishop. I guess maybe the word active should be in quotations, but we have a light square bishop that's outside the pawn chain, and it can go to some squares, but this is more of a category of a useless bishop because you might have a bishop there. You can even have more bishops if you want on light squares, but if it's not really attacking anything or defending anything, it's not really doing anything. So here's an actual more concrete example. This is a good active bishop, but if you play this endgame, if you know this endgame, you know that you want your bishop to be, the color of your bishop to be the same as your promotion square. And in this case, you're never going to win this because that's not the case. So that's also just a case where you might have a good active bishop and it's just kind of useless because it's just not what you need. This is another position where it's hard to put an exact label on what type of bishop this is, but this is, I would categorize as an unquote bad active bishop. The bishop has a lot of activities, but it's not good enough in this case for black to defend this position because white has this resource of trying to go take the h-pawn. And once you do try to go to the h-pawn with your king to try to defend it, white can just now use that opportunity to try to go for one of these two pawns and win the endgame. So white just has to play around with their knight to win this game. Versus in that same position, as comparison before, we saw the bishop. It was back behind the pawns, but now if it's on forward, maybe it's because of piece placement or just because now it's more active, but this is a draw. Now, if you try to go to the other side like you did in the scenario before, now black has this resource of trying to block the king, and you can't. If you trade, it's a draw, and this is with this active bishop, you get to actually draw the game instead of losing the game versus in the other position. So I guess regardless of the label you give the bishop, one key concept is always activity of the bishop. So now here's another position. We have a light square bishop for white, and there's a lot of pawns on the light squares here. The bishop is not controlling any of the dark squares where the knight and pawn are at, or they're just the light square bishop is controlling a lot of the light squares here. And in this position, the general advice for how to develop your bishop in the opening is just to put them on the opposite, put the pawns to the opposite color of the bishop. So for example, in the opening, you don't want to do this. If you just have one bishop, try to not to put it inside this pawn chain here. But if you do have the pawn chain, what you can do is try to just, maybe you want to play a6, and the idea of playing a6 is try to put the knight to a7 and put the bishop on b5 so you can trade the bishops off. So that's one idea. You can trade your bad bishop for white's active bishop, because it looks like white's bishop is doing much more than black's bishop here. But they can play this move a4, just stopping that whole resource, and that could be kind of hard to play against. So what's the solution to this? Maybe you want to try on the other side. And if you try on the other side, then you can maybe take advantage of these diagonals here. But one thing you just have to watch out for is that when you do trade pawns or try to push a pawn to open up your bishop, oftentimes, since this is the e6 pawn is the base of the pawn change, and it can be attacked by the rook here. And so this would be sort of just one thing to watch out for if you're playing. But just try different sides to open up the bishop. That'd be the advice. So the two ways to activate bad bishops is through pawn trades like we saw, and sometimes you can even sacrifice a pawn or a piece or even a queen, depending on the severity of the situation and the position, just to open up the bishop here. Here's some good quotes to remember if you want to take away anything from this video. So, only a good bishop can be sacrificed. A bad bishop can only be lost. With opposite colored bishops, the attacking side has in effect an extra piece in the shape of his bishop. So if you like the